In progress.
In progress, yes. Mute, close. On program.
Okay. We're online. Good. Erev Tov, everyone. Good evening. It's the day after Purim, as we all know. Just before we move on to Pesach, I'll take one last opportunity to talk about Purim this year. But I want to talk about the day after Purim. I've always been intrigued. You look in the story of the Megillah, what happens at the end of the story, the bit which is not written down? The day after, right? They all lived happily ever after. Not so simple, not so clear. When you think about it, and you look at the story itself, there are some clues within the text. There are some clues in Chazal. There are some clues. It's actually very interesting to look where else in Tanakh do we find mention of Mordechai and Esther. There's two places I'm aware of. I don't mean the Gemara in Chulin asks a question and says, right, Esther minat Torah minayin, Mordechai minat Torah minayin. It's talking about where's the roots. It says Haman minat Torah minayin. Where's the roots of the concept of Esther, of Mordechai and Haman? And also asks a very strange question there. The Gemara says Moshe minat Torah minayin. I mean Moshe Rabbeinu minat Torah minayin. He's everywhere in the Torah, except for Parashat Tetzaveh, which we just read, where Moshe's name was not mentioned. But the Gemara there gives a very cryptic answer. It says b'shegam u'basar. It's for another time. I'm not going to answer that now, but I'm not talking about that. I mean explicitly, where do we find the characters Mordechai and Esther mentioned in Tanakh outside of the context of the Purim story itself? So the truth is, and when you think about the story, you know what happened? They tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat. Everything is wonderful. We celebrate Purim to this day. It's all big simcha, big celebration. But after that momentary celebration, there and then, when they are celebrating the fact that they've overcome their enemies, that they survived, that they have a Yom Tov, things in a sense go back to normal. Go back to normal, which is not very good. Normal. Talk about this on three levels. One, in terms of the entire nation, and two, in terms of Mordechai himself, and in terms of Esther himself. So their stories, at first glance, don't work out necessarily so. So the first thing is, we mentioned and we saw over the last couple of days, right, the final parak of the Megillah, the last chapter, right, last three psukim, which seemingly don't have anything to do with anything. Talks about how Achashverosh goes back and brings a mass. It's all business as usual, right? We've mentioned the fact that on something very strange, on Purim, we don't say halal. Every festival we say halal, on Chanukah, which is also the Rabbanan, we say halal. Purim, we don't say halal. Gemara gives us three reasons why. Right? One reason is that really we do, in a sense, say halal. We read the Megillah. That is one opinion, one answer that's given, that because we have the story of the Megillah, which we read, and we tell the story, and we sing the praises of Hashem, in that way, we aren't required to say halal as well. But according to the other two answers, which the Gemara gives, there is no halal on Purim. Either because, answer number one, because it took place in Chutz La'aretz, and you don't say halal on a nes which took place in Chutz La'aretz once we came into Eretz Israel. That's the answer about Pesach, which the Gemara asks. It says Pesach was before. We're not talking about Yom Ha'atzmaut, we're talking about Purim. But the third answer is because Akati Avdei Achashverosh, we were still servants of Achashverosh. Everything went back to normal. Everything went back to normal, which is not a perfect, not an ideal situation, subjugated under this Persian king. And that was that. It's not so simple that it's all happily ever after. There were complexities, there were challenges at the time. That is one thing, that is one idea we find in there. We find something maybe even more shocking. Maybe it's not so shocking because it's familiar. But what happens to Mordechai? What happens to Mordechai at the end of the Purim story? And the Megillah tells us right at the end, that Mordechai ratzoi lerovecha. He was ratzoi, he was pleased to most of his brethren. Rovecha. Right? Which is, you think about, you can't win. You can never ever please everybody. Right? He's just literally saved the Jewish people. They owe their lives to him. He saved them from death, from destruction, from annihilation. And you know what? Most people were happy about it. But some were upset. It says the Gemara, not everybody. Why? It says, we're not talking about just anybody. We're talking about the other members of the Sanhedrin. We're talking about other leaders of the nation. And they say, this Mordechai guy, he's not all that he's cracked up. Why? So the Gemara says from here you learn, but so this is where Mordechai is mentioned in Tanakh in a number of other places, right? In Sefer Ezra and Nehemiah, we find the same list, which appears twice. It appears at the beginning in Ezra, Perek Bet, and later on in Sefer Nehemiah, Perek Zayin, same Sefer, but later on. And it says, and it's got a list of the significant leaders of the Jewish people who came back right after from Galut. And Mordechai's name is mentioned twice in both of those lists, but it's mentioned in a different order. The first time it's mentioned number 5, afterwards dropped down 2 places. So Chazal say in the Gemara, because he lost, after the Purim story, Mordechai lost his standing in the Sanhedrin. He went down, he was number 5, later number 7, whatever it is. And the Gemara says from here you learn as well, very, very strange. I think this Gemara needs to be studied in depth. But it says you learn here that Gadol Talmud Torah mehatzalat nefashot. That studying Torah is greater than saving lives, in a sense. In a sense, we have to understand what that means. It does not mean that if a person is sitting, in front of his Gemara, and there's a person is having a heart attack in front of him, and he has the opportunity to save his life, you say, no, I'm busy learning, let him die. No, chas v'shalom, that is not the pshat. That is not what the Gemara means, right? But it's in a certain sense talking about the intrinsic, right? There's a mitzvah of merit. You have the opportunity to do a mitzvah, and there's a whole sugya there, and the Gemara discusses. At what point should a person stop? At what point does a person have to, take a pause from their learning, from whatever mitzvah they're doing, to go and do something else? But in terms of all other things being equal, in terms of the intrinsic and the inherent value, it's telling you that Torah study is of such a value in a certain sense. That's what it means. And this was in a sense, this was the argument, so to speak, between Mordechai and the other members of the Sanhedrin. Because Mordechai stopped his learning, he left the yeshiva, he went out to go be involved in politics. He went out to go and sit in the court of the king and be involved in order to save the Jewish people. So some understand from the Gemara that maybe it means to say once the Purim story had taken place, once he had already saved them, so then he should have gone back. Then he should have handed in his resignation, and he could have gone back to the yeshiva. Right? And others say no, maybe it could have happened again. We see from the story how much the king can change his mind very easily and very quickly. He still needed to be there. Whatever, maybe Rav Lichtenstein, that's how the Rosh Yeshiva of Gush has a sikha where he talks about what was the machloket between Mordechai and the Sanhedrin. He gives 4 possibilities. He goes through a very interesting analysis. He says it could be, the Gemara in Kiddushin asks a question. It says, what is greater, Talmud or Math? What is greater, sitting and studying Torah or going out and acting, doing mitzvot? And there's a machloket in the Gemara. The answer that's given is Gadol Talmud shemevi lidei maaseh. Study is greater because it brings you to action. It doesn't really answer the question at the end of the day. But he says, so maybe, says Rav Lichtenstein, maybe the machloket between Mordechai and the other members of the Sanhedrin was on this point. What's greater here? Is greater Talmud or is greater Maaseh? Should you sit down and study and the intrinsic value of learning Torah will save, or should you go out and be involved? That's possibility number 1. Then he says possibility number 2, maybe that's not the machloket over here, because when the Gemara there talks about Maaseh, it's talking about Maaseh of mitzvah. It's not talking about Maaseh of politics or other worldly engagement, whatever it may be. So he says, maybe they both agreed on that, but they disagreed in terms of the definition of Maaseh. When we say Gadol Talmud Torah shemevi lidei Maaseh, which Maaseh are we talking about? Are we talking about specifically, exclusively Maaseh mitzvah? Or are we talking about things which are Maaseh Reshut, what we call, but it could lead to a mitzvah? Maybe that's the machloket between them. Then says Rav Lichtenstein, he goes on, maybe it's not what they were arguing about. He says maybe what they were arguing about was whether you say Talmud, maybe Maaseh is Gadol in certain contexts. But in terms of who you are, in terms of for the specific individual, if you're somebody who can go and can excel in a certain field in such a way, maybe they were saying, Mordechai, somebody else can go and save the Jewish people. You need to sit in there. Rav Rimon, the Rav of Gush Etzion, and of Machon Lev and Sulamot. So he told the stories that when he was in yeshiva, he said he was deciding what to do. He was convinced he was going to be a doctor. And one day he was in yeshiva and Rav Lichtenstein sat down with him. And he explained to him how important it is to go into medicine and how much it's saving the world and helping people and all these things. And he gave him a 20-minute schmooze about how important medicine is and how we need doctors and we need from doctors and the whole thing. And then he looked at him and he said, but not you. You need to go into the Rabbanut. So there was, sometimes that there is and then fourthly, he says, maybe, there's a question, not just on the individual, there's a question on the generation as well. Sometimes there's a time when it's more appropriate to engage in one. Sometimes it's more appropriate to engage in another. Anyway, very, very interesting analysis. It's available online. You can look it up. But the point is, we see that there was an argument, and we see that there was, again, Mordechai went down. He's just saved the Jewish people, and he goes down in his stature. He's looked upon as somebody who's not. Not everybody agrees that he was such a tzaddik. Not everybody agrees that he's a hero who's going to be loved. And then you have Esther. What happens to Esther the day after the Purim story ends, right? Everybody lives happily ever after. She's still stuck, married to this Persian king. She's there in the palace. We all remember the line, right? Mordechai says to Esther, maybe for this moment, to save the Jewish people. Well, she's been there. She saved the Jewish people. And now what? Now she's stuck. Now she's still there. She can't leave. Actually, this is where it's very interesting. So in Sefer Nehemiah, there's a story. It says when Nehemiah is talking to the king, and it says the king's consort was sitting there with him. The Malbim says that was talking about, there's different opinions in Chazal, which king and which time period, and it's all. But he says that that king was Daryavesh II, who was the son of Achashverosh and Esther. And he says Esther was there. That is a reference to and he was the one who gave permission to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. So maybe her tafkid is not yet ended. She's still there, and she's still encouraging, and she's still helping to save the Jewish people in that way. It could be. But anyway, but we see that she's still stuck where she is, and there's a discussion that goes on in the Gemara, which you all heard about. Those who are here at the Surah, you heard my son telling you the story from Chazal, right? Where Esther says to the Chachamim, "Kitvuni l'dorot," write down my story for all the generations, and the first answer is no, kinat merared aleinu bein ha'umot. So there's a tension. There's a tension that's still going on right now. We have the perspective we have of centuries later. We look back. Mordechai was a hero who saved the Jewish people. Esther was a hero who saved the Jewish people. Purim is something we celebrate in every generation, because in hindsight, we can look back and we can see overall that yes, something happened here, and there was an awakening, and there was something different, and something changed, and we may have still been of the Achashverosh, but ultimately there was a great salvation that took place. Ultimately, there's a great awakening that took place, and there was a great Geulah that took place. There are challenges, there are complexities, there are controversies at the time. But nonetheless, we come out of it. At the time, you have to work through those things. You have to zoom out. Rabbi Wein tells us so often. And we look at where we are, and we're in the moment. It's very sometimes it's difficult to see the bigger picture. When we look at Purim, we look historically at what happened. So we only see the bigger picture now, because that's what we know, and that's ultimately what prevailed, and that's ultimately what Am Yisrael has been celebrating for generations. But you look inside and you read between the lines. Yes, at that moment, the end of the Megillah tells us there was a celebration, they were happy. But after that, Mordechai, we're not so sure about. Esther, we're not so sure about. There's no halal, there's no this. At the time of Purim, and who knows for how long it took. Well, when people said maybe this Purim isn't really something to be celebrated, maybe there's all these difficulties. But we see ultimately when we have a long-term perspective, and we can zoom out. We can see what came of all of this, all the miracles, the hidden miracles that took place. And we can learn from that, of course, to our own days as well. Rabbi Hanania ben Akash, Amar, Tzakash Parfur, Zakot Israel, Lefechach Baalem Tom Mitzvot, Shnei Amar,